Welcome to the BizBen podcast, the show that explores all topics relating to selling and buying small to mid-sized California businesses. And now let's join nationally known consultant and author, the host of this podcast, Peter Siegel.
Hi, this is Peter Siegel with BizBen, and tonight on the Wednesday night at 8 webinar, we have Mark Chatow, who's going to talk to us about letters of intent versus purchase agreements. How you doing, Mark?
Hey, Peter. Great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for attending tonight's webinar. We appreciate it, and we have a lot of questions for you. Some of these questions have come from myself. Some of them you've contributed. Some of them have come from viewers. But I'd like to kind of get those started. Let's go ahead and start with question number one. What are the differences, actually, between an LOI and a purchase agreement?
Well, a letter of intent, or an LOI, is a preliminary document that we use typically to set the stage for a purchase agreement down the line. The idea is that if the buyer and the seller have general idea as to the terms that they're going to agree to, but they're not ready to get into a purchase agreement yet and want to do due diligence first, the letter of intent allows you to get things started before both parties dive into a full-fledged purchase agreement.
Now, would you advise the client to use an LOI to initiate a transaction rather than a purchase agreement?
Well, it depends on the transaction. You typically will see LOIs used in transactions that are a little larger than what you would do with an agreement from the start. And it also depends on whether the purchase is one where the seller is dealing with multiple offers. If you want to get something started and the seller has a lot of interest in the business and other people are going to be submitting purchase agreements directly, you might want to skip the LOI stage and go right into that. So when I take a look at a transaction with a client, we always try to get the temperature of the seller first, get an understanding what the transaction's like, and decide which is going to be the best to use. The advantages to using an LOI from both parties' perspectives is that they're less expensive to prepare and to review if you're going to retain counsel to look them through, and they can allow you to test the waters, smoke things out, see if there's a real deal on both sides before you go into all the effort of drafting an actual purchase agreement.
Good points. Now, I know when I was a business broker, whenever the other side on the transaction would produce these long LOIs, I kind of knew that they weren't real serious about it. On smaller transactions, let's say under 100,000, how many pages typically is an LOI?
Well, in general, I wouldn't probably even use an LOI for the most part for a transaction that size. The cost and the relative trade-offs, for the most part, aren't worth it unless you're pretty sure that the purchase agreement's not going to be, or that it's going to be going up against a bunch of other purchase agreements being submitted at the same time, and you don't want to spend money to draft a full-fledged agreement. But if we're looking at actually drafting an LOI, I try to keep them in that transaction size as short as possible, 2-3 pages at the most. If we're going up to a larger transaction size, you can get into the 4 to 5 pages. Beyond that, you're really going to keep it in that range unless you're getting up into a much larger transaction.
And Mark, how would you respond to a seller who absolutely refuses to sign an LOI and will only go directly to a purchase agreement?
Well, to me, that's potentially a great sign that this is not the right deal for the buyer. I've had the situation come up multiple times before where the seller has something to hide or has an issue where they're trying to get the buyer committed. Sometimes it can be at the direction of their broker, who could be well-intentioned and trying to represent their seller, but trying to push a buyer into a purchase agreement, which may not be the right fit or the direction at that point. Again, it depends on the type of transaction, though. If you're looking at a transaction where it's a smaller deal and the transaction's fairly straightforward. The terms are fairly straightforward. There's some agreement as to what those terms are, and you've got a good feeling from the seller, and the seller says, let's get right into a purchase agreement. That's a little different than seller and broker aren't really communicating too well with you and won't look at anything unless it's a purchase agreement. So we want to weigh what the situation is and take it accordingly. But in general, I'd say if the deal warrants an LOI, it's the right size, we still don't have enough agreement on terms, and there's some issues about the nature of the deal, and the seller refuses to even consider an LOI, I would probably back away unless it was the deal that absolutely had to be done.
Good point. Are there times when you would advise skipping the LOI and going directly to a purchase agreement? I know we just talked about one where it was a smaller transaction, but are there other instances where you would advise that?
Well, I think that if the buyer and the seller have a good understanding as to the terms, that can be advisable. I have a deal that I'm working on right now where the buyer and the seller have known each other for 15 plus years. The buyer is a vendor of the seller's. And in a situation like that, where you've got some comfort, you may not need to do an LOI. You can draft up a term sheet that has some outline of what the terms are, and as long as you're in agreement, you could take it right into purchase agreement. I think also in a situation where you've got a very unique business or a business that business type that doesn't come on the market very often in your area, and you're concerned you're going to lose it if you don't go into a purchase agreement, or that your offer may not be as strong. If you go LOI and everyone else is signing a purchase agreement, then that could be an applicable time to get the purchase agreement done as well. I think it's also important, though, to note there are purchase agreements and then there are purchase agreements. You've got a standard form purchase agreement, which may not be conducive to the buyer's best interests. Getting right into that may not be the best direction for the buyer. At the same time, getting something in that's too complicated, doesn't address the seller's needs, can kill a deal. So you've got to be careful if you're going to go right into a purchase agreement that you've got the right form, but at the same time that you're making it balanced so that it meets both parties' needs.
Do you tend to draft shorter summary LOIs, or do you get into more detail from the very start?
I like to make sure that we get enough detail that we're flushing out the key points that could potentially become problems down the line, but not more than that. It's a careful balance. You don't want to flood the seller with too much information from the start, make them feel that the deal is going to get too bogged down in the details. At the same time, I like to use the LOI as a way to test the waters, and if there are certain deal points that I know my buyer is going to be adamant about, we want to make sure we get those into the LOI. Otherwise, oftentimes you're wasting time. You get into a transaction with the seller, you start to get into the purchase agreement, and you find out, weeks or even months later that something that should have been covered in the LOI that wasn't now becomes a deal breaker. Good
point. What are some common mistakes buyers and sellers make regarding LOIs and purchase agreement and the process of doing so?
Well, I think you touched on one of them before with LOIs, which is that you get into too much detail and you turn the LOI into a purchase agreement. The other mistake that I've seen is that sellers will get into an LOI, think that it's just an LOI and that it couldn't possibly be a binding agreement. And in a lot of states, including California, it actually can be if the language is set so that there's an expectation that it's a binding agreement. You've got to be really careful. Even if it says non-binding, sometimes you can set up provisions in the LOI inadvertently that turn it into a binding agreement. So that's one of the mistakes that you sometimes will see. I also see, and I see this more frequently lately, buyers getting into what they think are LOIs because it's a short form agreement that's called a letter of offer or an offered letter or something like that. They use the word letter, but it really is a contract. And so you've got a problem where buyers are signing these documents they think are just a letter of intent, form documents provided by a broker possibly, and it turns out that they're actually an agreement. You can usually tell one of those if it's a 1 or 2 pager and it's pre-printed and it's provided by a broker versus something that's drafted by counsel, which most likely if it's drafted by counsel as an LOI, it's truly going to be a letter of intent.
That brings me to the next point is when would you recommend drafting a purchase agreement rather than using one of the standard form agreements?
Well, this is another situation where you've got to really weigh what's going on with the transaction on the seller side. If it's a small transaction to start with, and if the seller is getting multiple offers, if they're in a market where this is an opportunity that's hot, you don't want to miss it. If the broker is going to potentially give preference to something that uses their form agreement because they're comfortable with it, those are times when I'd consider at least starting with a standard form agreement. There's very few times where I would use the standard form agreement as written just because I also do litigation, and I've seen too many times on the other side what happens when you use a standard form agreement and you don't make the changes that are necessary to make sure that it answers problems that can come up down the line and resolves them before they become bigger issues. So in general, if you're going to look at drafting a purchase agreement versus using a standard form agreement, it would be in a situation where it's a larger transaction, which really depends on the seller and the buyer's personal perspective as to what's large. Some people are comfortable using a form transaction as a base for a transaction of $500,000. Some people would want to draft a custom purchase agreement at that point. I'd also recommend it where you've got a more complex deal. If you're adding in purchase financing or seller carryback financing, if you've got contingencies that aren't your standard contingencies, if there's a lot of disclosures, reps and warranties, it's important to put those into the purchase agreement. And most of the time, the standard form agreements don't cover a lot of those points.
Good. And then, Mark, what are the 3 most important elements of a well-drafted purchase agreement from both the buyer and the seller side?
Well, from both sides, the 3 most important provisions or elements of a well-drafted purchase agreement to start are your reps and warranties. And your representations and warranties are the representations that a seller gives on their side, a buyer gives on their side as to the nature of the business. For the buyer's side, they're doubly important because the seller's presenting what they're going to essentially guarantee about the nature of the business and what's going on with it, as well as their promises as to how the business is being run, what they've provided in terms of financials, and in terms of other documents on the business. So the reps and warranties are key. If you don't have good representations and warranties, it's almost impossible after the fact to go back and try to get a remedy for a problem that you have with the sale of the business. I'll give you an example. I've got a case I'm working on right now where the buyer purchased a business, was given some limited financial information. It was a form purchase agreement, and the reps and warranties didn't really state that the financial information was correct and accurate. They didn't state that everything representing the financial statement of the business or standards of the business had been presented in the disclosures. And so the buyers had a tough time because of that, trying to get remedies after the sale of the business where they think that some things were misrepresented. The second thing that's important in a purchase agreement, and really this goes on both sides, buyer and seller, is disclosures. Disclosures are the pieces of information that the seller will tell you about the business and expressly warrants that those are true. So, for example, the seller may disclose that there was a fire in the business previously and that it was caused by wiring that was faulty, just to give you an example off the top of my head from a deal I had recently. From the seller's perspective, it's important because if there's late array fire from the same type of wiring, they're on record as having told the buyer that this problem existed and that how it was rectified and what the procedure was to get it taken care of. From the buyer's perspective, obviously it's crucial because you want to make sure that either the seller is telling you if there's problems exist, or by telling you that they don't exist, they're essentially representing that problem doesn't exist. So everything from the condition of the premises to employee issues to past liabilities that may creep up, all of those things can be brought up in disclosures, and they're important. So disclosures would be the second most important portion of a purchase agreement in terms of the key elements. And then finally, and I think this gets overlooked a lot, is termination provisions. Everyone goes into a purchase agreement thinking that the deal is going to work out, we're going to get this done, and everyone's going to move on and be happy. And unfortunately, it doesn't always happen that way, as we both know. Sometimes the seller changes their mind. Sometimes the buyer changes their mind. Sometimes they both change their mind. And it's important to work out ahead of time what's going to happen when termination takes place. A lot of purchase agreements that you find standard on the market don't really address termination very well, and they leave things up in the air if the deal doesn't work out as everyone's expected. So it's important to have a good termination provision in place. From the buyer's perspective, obviously you want to be able to get out as easily as you can with as limited cost as possible. From the seller's perspective, if there's a deposit, there's a couple of issues that can create problems. One, you want to make sure that you're able to retain that deposit if the buyer actually is in breach. And secondly, you want to make sure that that's not your only remedy. I've had a case where a buyer had purchased or had intended to purchase a business, didn't continue the purchase of the business properly, and there were issues as to what the actual remedy was. Was the deposit that they had given the only remedy, or could the seller go after them for additional remedies? And the language that the purchase agreement has around that termination and what happens to that deposit if the contract's terminated is crucial, because if it's not done properly, you can, as a seller, be limited to just the deposit, where the buyer may have caused more problems for you if they dragged the purchase on and then decided not to fulfill it at the end of the deal.
Good points. All right. So now, how do you address concerns that if a seller gets skittish? I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. How do you address concerns that a seller may get skittish if a buyer submits a longer purchase agreement? We talked about this a little bit, but maybe you can expand on that.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of key points. And this goes to contracts in general. You know, people love the idea of the one-page contract or the two-page contract. Oh, it's easy to read. It's not going to be a lot of language to go through. I had a client the other day that had a long contract, and they asked me to turn it into a short contract. And one of the first things we did was look at the type size. So just by changing type, you're going to turn a long agreement into a shorter one, and that doesn't always mean that there's less language there. A lot of these form agreements that are out there in the market use very small type, and if you expanded it, they really turn into a longer agreement. So I think there's this misperception that certain agreements are shorter than they really are. That's the first thing I would try to help the seller understand, is that the purchase agreement, if it's well drafted and it's got a typeface that's actually legible and it's well spaced, doesn't necessarily turn into a longer purchase agreement. Sometimes it's just a purchase agreement that happens to be on more pages, but there's just as many or even fewer words as some of the form agreements that are out there. The second thing that I try to do is, if possible, have the broker, if they're involved, or if not, talk to the seller directly and take their temperature on it. Explain to them that a purchase agreement that's well drafted and lengthy or lengthier, it doesn't mean that it's not in their favor, and a lot of times it actually works to the benefit of the seller to have a longer purchase agreement because it covers things that potentially could be a problem for them as well. So For example, as I mentioned before, the provisions on what happens in termination. If you don't have good termination provisions, the seller's not going to be protected either. And so a lot of the times when I work with a seller, when I'm representing the buyer, but I'm able to work with the seller directly if they're not represented by counsel, or if they're represented by a broker, but we've got a good level of communication, we can get everybody involved on a call. I'll try to explain to them that a well-drafted purchase agreement should be balanced, and it really protects both parties. So just because it's a little bit longer or may appear to be longer doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be a worse deal for the seller. It can be a lot of times just something that's going to cover more of the potential issues that would come up after the deal closes than an agreement that's shorter that wouldn't cover those. So it's a bit of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. At the end of the day, you're better off taking a little bit more time, going with a little bit more language, not overkill. You've got to be careful about that, and helping the seller understand that if the agreement's well drafted, it'll protect them and it'll protect the buyer.
All right, we have a buyer weighing in with a question on the chat. They are asking, purchasing a business in the name of a new entity, such as a LLC or S Corp, that they're going to form. When is the best time to form that entity, and should the purchase be made in the entity's name or the individual buyer's name? Thank you to the buyer who just submitted that. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, great question. The best time to form the entity, if you're comfortable that the deal is going to go through or that you're going to use that entity for at least some transaction, even if this transaction doesn't go through, is form it sooner rather than later. Get it taken care of so that your paperwork's processed, you're ready to go. You can file anything else that you need to file. You can get your bank accounts opened. All that takes some time. And then take the purchase, and this is again assuming that you're buying it as an asset sale, which most businesses these days are being sold as in this range. Take the business assets that you're purchasing in the name of the new business. The reason it's beneficial to do that is that although it's certainly possible and not difficult from a legal perspective to buy it in the buyer's name and then as an individual and then transfer those assets over to your new entity, it creates a little bit more exposure. And if you're contracting with the seller as the individual buyer rather than contracting as the entity, you're opening yourself up to a little bit of liability that you wouldn't have necessarily if you did it all through the entity. If things go wrong, it's going to be much easier for the seller to come after the buyer as an individual if they signed it as an individual than if they signed it as a corporation if the entity was properly formed. It's also easier to create a clean paper trail as far as the asset ownership and potentially for taxes as well, and certainly for accounting, even if it doesn't have an actual tax burden. It's cleaner and more straightforward and easier if you can just get your entity formed and then take the assets in the name of the entity first.
The buyer's giving you a big thumbs up on that response. Good job. All right. Now we have a seller asking a question. The seller is asking, at what point in the transaction should a buyer or seller talk to legal counsel about drafting or entering into an LOI or purchase agreement?
So, of course, as legal counsel, the correct answer is immediately, but the realistic answer, of course, the realistic answer is, and I tell this to clients all the time, clients who call in, having seen me on BizBen, I try to discourage clients actually from engaging too quickly with me because you don't want to ring up costs until you've got a business that you really know you want to buy. I'm always happy to talk with people, and they're welcome to call. And I spend a few minutes with them. The meter's not going to be running to get my initial opinion on something, but they don't want to start spending money with me until they've found a business that they're confident is the right business. They're ready to either submit an LOI or a purchase agreement, and they're ready to go. What I do caution about is if you're going to wait, make sure that you don't sign anything at all until you've engaged with counsel, and don't sign, whether it's an NDA. I've seen people sign what they thought was an NDA that turned out to be more than it. So it really is important that if you are getting ready to engage and you're thinking about using counsel to purchase your business, before you sign anything like that, it's always a good idea to actually engage with counsel, have them take a look at it, and make sure that you're not going to get yourself into a situation you inadvertently don't want to be in. I've also found that, from my perspective, given that I've got personal experience growing, building, selling a company that got to pretty good size, buying another business afterwards, having gone through the process where I bought it, sold it, took it back after the seller defaulted, or after the buyer defaulted on their note, and then grew it back again and still own it. A lot of times I can give buyers or sellers advice that they may not be able to get from other counsel. I think the brokers, especially in the BizBen community, are phenomenal and do a great job. It's nice at the same time to be able to get some independent advice from somebody who's got an outside perspective on a deal too. And so while I don't encourage clients to engage too early, I always encourage people to call me, have a chat, no charge to just talk and see if it's the right time to engage or not.
Another thumbs up from the seller, Mark. Good job. Usually at the beginning of a webinar, I usually try and introduce my panel members and or co-presenters. Mark Chatow has been more than generous with his time tonight in tonight's webinar on LOIs versus purchase agreements. Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you provide to buyers and sellers of California businesses. I typically do this at the beginning of a webinar. I was remiss at doing so if you could tell me a little bit about yourself, that'd be great.
Sure. So I started out on the legal side. I graduated from USC Law in 1993, and I promptly got out of the legal field and started a company with a couple buddies of mine. We grew it from the three of us to a couple hundred people, about $60 million in revenue, and we sold it about 9 years later. It was a consumer products company, and so I had a pretty broad base of experience in everything from startup to growing a company, defending it, protecting it, losing sleep over it, and then eventually selling it. And right after that, or shortly after that, I bought another business, much smaller, more of the typical small business that BizBen would typically have on the site. And I bought that business, grew it, sold it, as I mentioned earlier, ended up taking it back. And so I've been through that cycle of it as well. From my practice perspective, what I try to do when I work with clients is take a lot of that business experience and meld it with the legal experience so that my clients get a nice blend of business expertise, been there and done that expertise with a dose of legal reality so that we're moving deals forward, but we're doing it in the right way so that they're not getting caught into situations where down the line they're going to have problems. And we do that. The services I offer include everything from consulting on transaction type and entity structure. You're asking about forming your LLC or your corporation if you're going to take the assets ahead of time. So I'll work with clients on formation. I'll also advise them on the deal types, deal structure, in terms of how they want to handle the transaction from a tax perspective. I'll work with their tax professional if they have one to make sure that the deal is going to give them the right balance of protection, safety, tax benefit. And then once the deal kicks in, we actually will start working on everything from drafting the LOI, if necessary, to the purchase agreement. I do the legal due diligence, which includes everything from reviewing contract documents that are existing for the business, working on the leases, working on the business's corporate records. One of the very first things I do actually usually is a litigation and background check on the seller to make sure that there's no issues with them previously, actually seller or buyer, depending on who I'm representing. And then from there, I also work on the escrow instructions. A lot of things get tossed into the escrow instructions that people don't realize, so we work with escrow to make sure that the instructions represent what actually is being intended by the seller and the buyer. And then I work on post-close to make sure that everything gets wrapped up smoothly after the deal is done.
Fantastic. Mark, again, I really appreciate you being on the panel tonight and tonight's webinar on LOIs and purchase agreements and being my co-presenter. And I look forward to having you in future events. Thanks again.
Thanks, Peter. I really appreciate you having me on. Enjoyed it, and look forward to coming back.
Thank you for joining today's featured show with your host, Peter Siegel, on the BizBen podcast. When buying or selling a California business, franchise, or business opportunity, make sure you receive professional advice on all legal and business matters pertaining to any transactions. The opinions and information expressed by today's guest are not necessarily endorsed by BizBen and Business Exchange Networking. Please join us again in the future to learn, share, and experience case studies, interviews, and focused information on the topic of selling and buying small to mid-sized California businesses.